Good afternoon. Welcome to this forum, which is focusing on achieving a green and inclusive recovery post-COVID. The first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated very clearly how interconnected we are in this world. The pandemic spread across the world with great speed, touching several geographies. In some cases, the economic impacts, in fact, reached a number of developing countries even before they recorded their very first case of COVID-19. So it is very clear that we all live in one connected world where we need each other, where in fact we must collaborate as we go forward, because we will be meeting more crises in the future. And in fact, we have already been warned by scientists that yes, there will be more epidemics and more pandemics going forward. We want to thank the IMF and the World Bank, a number of development finance institutions, several multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, for the speed with which they moved to support and help various countries, particularly developing countries, deal with the initial economic shocks. And I'm sure we'll hear some of what they've done already in this session as we go forward. I also want to thank my colleague parliamentarians. A number of the stimulus packages and other response measures that were put in place had to be approved by many of us who are parliamentarians representing the people. And so we made our own contributions in shaping those response packages. It is obvious that going forward, as we look at the future, that we have to invest in those sectors that will create more jobs and open up economic space for our citizens. It is also obvious that we have to invest in strengthening the capabilities of our health infrastructure. Of course, COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of a number of our health services across the world. What is not obvious, and we hope we can cover in this session, is the need for us to be more ambitious beyond the immediate job creation and beyond the immediate investments in the health sector, to push for a greener post-COVID society and a more inclusive post-COVID society. The question then is, where would these resources come from if we have to be more ambitious and if we have to push for a greener, inclusive post-COVID global society? Because many countries are already stretched and debt burdens are very heavy. But the post-COVID society, if we talk about inclusivity, also has to be climate resilient. As we look to the future, we already know now that we have to build back better. Part of building back better includes accelerating and facilitating energy transitions across the world. In the case of poorer developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, inclusivity has to mean universal access to energy services. We saw immediately in very poor countries that nexus between availability of energy and effective and efficient health service delivery. We immediately saw the relationship between access to energy and availability of clean water and sanitation. So in this green and inclusive new post-COVID society we want to build, investing in energy transitions and availability of energy across the board is going to be key. I wish to emphasize that already WHO has shown the relationship between air pollution, whether outdoor air pollution or indoor air pollution, and the susceptibility to COVID-19. If we take that for a minute and just connect that to climate change, we will see that in fact, globally already, we're losing 7 million people every year around the world to outdoor air pollution. But we are also losing 4 million people to premature deaths due to household air pollution because of the use of firewood and charcoal. Very recently, the World Bank estimate University of Loughborough and the Clean Cooking Alliance showed already that 4 billion people around the world lack access to modern energy cooking services. What does that tell you? That already we have in poorer developing countries, in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, other parts of South and Southeast Asia, almost 2.8 billion people who may have already pre-existing conditions because of pulmonary diseases caused by household air pollution. So when we look at creating this new post-COVID, green post-COVID inclusive society, access to energy has to be one of the key issues we address, along with its ability and the opportunity that access to energy provides for greener cities, for creating more economic development in communities through distributed energy, but also particularly for driving growth and job creation in various economies. But where will the resources come from? How do we push for more international solidarity to achieve this? Let me give you a quotation before I open up now to our keynote speakers. Last week, in the 75th anniversary of the UN, the Secretary General put it this way, and I want to quote him, and I quote, "We must move forward with humility, recognizing that the microscopic virus has brought the world to its knees. We must be united. We have seen when countries go in their own direction, the virus goes in every direction. Solidarity is self-interest," unquote. Within that context, I want to open up this discussion, keeping in mind how much international solidarity we're going to need going forward as one people on this planet, to see how we deal with future pandemics, but also to see how we can grow economies in a better way and create job opportunities and livelihoods for the rest of humanity. With that said, I want to go to our panel. We've put together for you a very good panel that will address a number of the issues that I have raised and more for the understanding of the public, but also to see how we parliamentarians can support various global efforts to create this new post-COVID society that will be greener and inclusive. Our first speaker will be Carmen Reinhardt, Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you. It is a pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is a pleasure to be here. I will offer remarks on the global outlook and some of the risks to the global outlook and some of the policies that could mitigate those risks. So in the question of building back better, the first question that one, or a first question that one would want to address is, over what time horizon? What are the challenges posed by the COVID crisis are global in scope and long in duration. And so the challenges we are facing now are quite substantive. Let me just put in perspective the global in scope and the issue of duration. The global in scope, if when we talked about the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we were really talking, it was called the global financial crisis, but it was a crisis, it was a financial crisis in 11 advanced economies. Post 2000, emerging markets, developing countries were temporarily impacted in late 2008, early 2009 by the global turmoil, but subsequent to that, the recovery was swift, it was decisive. It wasn't particularly green, but it was a a period where recovery came much quicker. Um, the situation that we're in terms of the numbers of countries being affected by the crisis, you really have to go back, and Gita, my colleague across the street, has written about this. You really have to go back to the 30s to find such an engulfing global economic downturn and crisis. Because for those of you, familiar with the debt difficulties and the crises of the 1980s, that crisis hit the emerging markets, but not the advanced economies. And so this one is truly global. And in terms of recovery, I think a message that I would like to leave with you is, do not confuse rebound with recovery. Rebound will no doubt is already indeed well underway in a number of countries after very massive declines in economic activity earlier this year, very massive increases in unemployment. And the difference between rebound and recovery is that rebound actually doesn't leave you as well off as you were before the crisis. So what I am concretely saying is my own expectation is that, judging from historic patterns, per capita incomes will take a while to recover. And historically, that recovery can mean 5 years, can mean 6 years, and even longer in some cases. And what is very troubling about this economic crisis and health crisis is that it's also a social crisis. It is a very regressive kind of crisis, meaning that it is the poorest within countries and the poorest across countries that are getting the bigger damage, that are taking the biggest losses. World Bank estimates of global poverty, the Poverty and Shared Prosperity report that came out a couple of weeks ago, basically highlighted the first surge in global poverty in more than 2 decades. So I do not want to, for a more upbeat assessment, I will turn to Gita on the road ahead, but I don't want to leave a message that underscores I want to leave a message that underscores the seriousness of the current crisis in many dimensions. And the social dimension is a major challenge. And in terms of other challenges, and these actually say quite a bit about how green, how strong we can make things happen, because many governments in low and middle income countries, in addition to the health challenges, the economic challenges, the social challenges that are being posed by COVID, are also facing debt difficulties in varying degrees. Among the IDA countries that are eligible for our debt suspension, the debt suspension initiative, about half of the countries are either in debt distress or fast approaching debt distress. This makes, this is a big uh, um, headwind to recovery because financing gaps are large, and at the same time, uh, the debt sustainability problems create a tension between the need to uh, bring debt into a sustainable path and all the immediate needs, social, economic, and related, obviously, uh, to mitigating climate uh, uh, climate change risks. In terms of that trade-off, I think a message that I would like to leave that highlights, the need for global cooperation is that it's really a call also for the private sector, which has been to date uh, outside the DSSI, not participating in the DSSI, um, to participate. It is a call on the global community, private and public, to start really thinking very seriously also about, in building back better, also how to cope with the legacy of COVID, and how to deal with the debt overhang problem, and at the same time the social problems that COVID has brought to the forefront. So my message is building back better is essential. Building back greener is essential, but we have a lot of headwinds. And to deal with those headwinds, global cooperation and cooperation between debtor countries and creditor countries, private and official, that cooperation is a step, is a big step in the right direction. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Carmen. It was a somber note, though, that the recovery will be longer, and the distinction you made between rebound and recovery, stressing also this social regression, this bigger impact on the poorest of the poor, and the need to balance this legacy of COVID and the debt overhang, but also trying to deal with these social imbalances. Now I would like to invite Jita Gopinath, Chief Economist of the IMF. Probably you will give us some positive projections going forward about how we can even further what Carmen said about this global solidarity to muster the resources we're going to need to really move in a more positive trajectory going forward. Over to you, Jita.
Thank you so much, Honorable Kande Yunkela. Thanks for putting together the session, and clearly very important topics. And I agree completely with what Carmen said, that there are many headwinds, and the need for international cooperation has never been more urgent. So I'm going to speak on this topic, but I'm going to talk about addressing the risks from climate change. So thank you for the opportunity to speak on this topic. And it's been around for a while, the issue of climate change, but I believe it's acquired ever more urgency now. The climate crisis is intensifying. Global temperatures could rise by 2 to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, with catastrophic results. And already we are seeing some of the warmest years on record. And you can see the devastating effects, for instance, in the wildfires that have been raging in the US and in Australia. Now, I think it's a perfectly good question to ask about why are we worrying about climate change in the midst of a pandemic, which is top of mind of policymakers around the world. But I think there are obvious reasons why it should be top of mind. One is because we've seen the devastation to economies that come from having one disaster, which has been a pandemic, something completely unforeseen. And you can imagine what it would be like if we continue on the trajectory we are with respect to climate change and the catastrophic impact that can have on economies everywhere in the world. The second point is that tackling climate change is not just a long-term issue, it is urgent, and it's also not at odds with dealing with this crisis that we are in. In fact, we believe that this disruption that's come from this pandemic is a unique opportunity to build a stronger, greener, and more sustainable economy, and that the right kinds of policies on the climate front can actually boost the recovery coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. So in the latest World Economic Outlook, what we have shown are policies that can be used to mitigate climate change by reducing net emissions of carbon dioxide to zero by 2050, while at the same time achieving growth, income equality, and employment. Creating new jobs is especially important because the pandemic is likely to destroy a significant number of jobs forever, given the kinds of transformations that are taking place at this point, and which is why a policy push of the kind that I'm going to spell out will also help bring about a more job-rich recovery. So now let me turn to the policies, specifically to the design of these climate mitigation policies. Now, just very briefly, to mitigate climate change, the policies that you will need will be ones that make it costlier, relatively more costly to use dirty or carbon-intensive energy, and that will also reduce energy intensity more broadly. So you want to shift the mix of energy that you use, but you also want to reduce the amount of energy that is being used. So keeping in mind the need to support a job-rich and fair recovery, while also addressing climate change, we are advocating for a three-pronged approach that combines, firstly, a green fiscal stimulus, second, carbon pricing, and third, redistributive policies. So what I'm going to go into next is to describe each of these in more detail. So on the first, what exactly are we talking about when we say a green stimulus? By this, we have, firstly, the need for green public spending on electrification and cleaner energy generation and in low emission transportation networks. So for example, having electric vehicle charging stations. But we also need green public incentives to promote greater reliance on renewables, energy, and cleaner and more efficient appliances and cars. Now, the green infrastructure push is the critical near-term policy element which will achieve two goals. First, it will boost global GDP and employment in the initial years of the recovery from this crisis. So under the policy package considered in our analysis, global GDP would be on average higher by about 0.7% in the first 15 years of the recovery. And since green energy is more labor intensive than fossil fuel-based energy, employment would increase by about 12 million persons globally in the first 7 years. Now, second, the green infrastructure push will also increase productivity in low carbon sectors, thereby incentivizing the private sector to invest in them. Now, that said, a green stimulus alone will not be sufficient to achieve the rapid and substantial reduction in carbon emissions that is needed to maintain temperature at safe levels. For that, we need the second prong of the approach, which is a gradual increase in carbon prices. Now, carbon pricing is a very effective and a critical tool to achieve a sustained reduction in global carbon emissions. And it does that in two ways. Firstly, by having a pre-announced, credible, and gradually rising path for carbon prices, it will steer consumption and, importantly, new investment towards sustainable activities and green technologies. Secondly, the higher cost of dirty energy will incentivize energy efficiency and also reduce overall energy intensity. But the transition from a high to low carbon economy will entail costs. And this is especially the case of poor households, as they spend a larger share of their incomes on energy and are more likely to be employed in carbon intensive sectors. Now, even though jobs will likely be gained in the less carbon intensive sectors, there would clearly be transitional costs for people with jobs in these high carbon sectors, where they will have significant job losses. So this is why we need the third prong. We need redistributive policies for a fair transition to a low carbon economy. Now, governments can use various policies to limit the adverse effects of higher carbon prices on households. Firstly, they can fully or partially rebate the carbon revenues through cash transfers targeted lower income households. For example, in the United States, our research found that to fully protect the consumption of households in the bottom 40% of the income distribution, the US government would need to transfer 55% of all carbon pricing revenues. In the case of China, this figure would be 40% of carbon pricing revenues. Secondly, governments can spend some of the carbon revenues on low carbon sectors to support job transitions from high to low carbon sectors, and also provide retraining and job search assistance for workers. Now, such measures are crucial to build and strengthen public support for climate action. Let's move to the costs and the benefits. Now, this fundamental shift in our economic structures clearly sounds daunting and a potentially very costly task. But the good news, and this is what comes out of our research, is that the cost in terms of output is actually rather modest and quite manageable. So let me be more precise. After an initial boost to economic activity, thanks to the green stimulus package, global output would be lower by 0.7% on average between 2036 and 2050, and slightly more than 1% in 2050 compared to a no action scenario. Now, considering that global output is projected to grow by 120% between now and 2050, this is a small dent. Also, if we include the important additional benefits, such as better health outcomes and smaller health costs as a result of reduced pollution, the policy package would actually be neutral for global output. Now, growth in the medium and long term will be harmed considerably unless climate change is addressed now. And this makes the benefits from mitigation much higher than any temporary benefits from inaction. Of course, these policies would add to the global stock of debt. Now, we expect the debt would rise by somewhere between 5 and 6% of GDP by 2050. So this is over several years. But this would easily also be offset by the substantial long-run benefits in terms of output and employment. Also, we cannot lose sight of the fact that not all countries will be equally affected, because we have fast-growing countries with large energy needs like India, and there are countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels for income, and they will bear larger costs in terms of output. Now, some of these countries may need to be supported, or the ambitiousness of these policies should be scaled by country circumstances. But people in some of these countries also recognize that they already have places in their country that have become unlivable due to climate change, and that their country is at very high risk from climate change. So such countries would also benefit greatly from improved health outcomes due to lower fossil fuel use. So in conclusion, I hope I have convinced you that addressing climate change is not only critical from a long-term perspective, but it's also a vital piece of what we need to recover from the economic destruction that's been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our work in the World Economic Outlook focused on the macroeconomic effects of climate policies. However, one very important dimension that deserves further examination is international cooperation on climate action. The objective of limiting temperature increases by 2100 to between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade was endorsed worldwide by policymakers in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Yet for most countries, the nationally determined contributions pledged under the Paris Agreement are deemed insufficient to meet either the 1.5 degrees centigrade or the 2 centigrade target. And judging by current policies, these pledges are also unlikely to be met in the first place. Now, while I take great heart from the positive announcements on climate action by key countries recently, I would like to reiterate that we cannot afford to delay scaling up action on climate change. We must come together to grasp the opportunity for transformative change presented by the pandemic to take concrete steps in this direction. So thank you, and with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much, Jita. That is really a call to action, that as we deal with the pandemic, we also have to keep our eyes on the bigger risk of climate change, and that in fact we can use green stimulus to achieve some of what we want to achieve immediately to deal with the effects of the pandemic, but also create a better future that is greener. And you've really outlined the various benefits. You've shown us some of the costs, but the benefits seem to outweigh the costs in the long run. Thank you very much. We have two discussants, and I will start right away with Marlene Forte, Member of Parliament and Attorney General for Jamaica. Marlene, maybe your mic is mute.
I am, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Honorable Kende, Kumkela, Carmen and Jita and Martin, my colleague parliamentarians who are tuned in virtually across the globe. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I greet you well from Kingston, Jamaica. I'd just like to begin by thanking the Parliamentary Network of the Bank and the Fund for affording me the opportunity to participate in this forum, and also, more importantly, for providing such an important platform for dialogue amongst parliamentarians. I believe that the significance of the forum is even more evident as countries world over grapple with the impact of changed circumstances brought about by this COVID-19 pandemic. I've listened carefully to both Carmen and Jita and your own opening remarks, moderator. And I think that whether my colleague parliamentarians are fresh out of general elections in the midst of this pandemic with a renewed mandate like I am or not, all members, as members of parliament, we know firsthand what is happening on the ground as we see the people whom we're elected to represent, how their lives are impacted and what has been unleashed upon them in the wake of COVID-19. As Carmen said, what began as a health crisis has become a full-blown economic crisis and now a burgeoning social crisis. My role as Attorney General of Jamaica has placed me at the heart of my country's response. In fact, I was charged with the responsibility of designing the legal response and the rules that we would put in place. But more importantly, I get to see from a bird's eye perspective, the policies and the programs that are crafted and implemented in response to COVID. And I'd just like to share some observations on three aspects. First has to do with the rapid adjustments and rebalancing balancing of budgets that have been undertaken and must be undertaken by government in response to the pandemic. And secondly, the interconnectedness of the social and economic issues arising from the pandemic and the need for programs and policies to be inclusive and pragmatic to meet the needs of the people. And then the unique challenges of the post-pandemic economic recovery. Jamaica acted decisively, using my country as an example, to slow the delay of the community transmission phase. And we did that for 6 months. We were able to buy time to strengthen the health system, to procure PPEs, to stock up on drugs, and to engage in some public education. But the strategies also slowed or depressed economic activities. So not unique to Jamaica, the closing of the airports and the seaports, closing of businesses. What happened? Decline in revenue. And so we've had to do a lot of rebalancing. We have need for additional expenditure in health, social welfare, and economic expenditure. And then the question that arose is how much of the increased expenditure can be financed by existing revenue, how much borrowing would have to be considered, and then with the borrowing come an increase in the debt stock for a country has struggled for a long time with a very high debt to GDP ratio and has just managed to get things under control. But I think more importantly is to look at the envelope of expenditure that can sustainably be financed. In Jamaica, we have legal expenditure, which ranks over others, over which you have no discretion. For example, compensation, and interest on and repayment of debt. And then, you know, these are just always higher legal priority, not necessarily morally so, as the Minister of Finance put it. But these are finances that are characterized by rigidity, not flexibility, and they amount to a high percentage of our own GDP. Then you have the pandemic response. And for us, this is where the inclusivity becomes a critical question. Universal access to education. Schools were ordered closed, and we indicated that we would not resume with face-to-face teaching for the most part, but a blended approach. And so teaching went online instead of in the classrooms. What that meant is that students needed access to tablets and laptops, and they needed access to broadband internet service, needed access to electricity, and the poor rural communities, the inequality of the access became even more evident. So, you know, it's really been a huge challenge for countries like Jamaica. I noted Dr. Reinhardt in a September 2000 article in the Foreign Affairs. You spoke about the government around the world have to deploy economic firepower on a scale rarely seen before in order to fund the public health and other measures in response to the pandemic. And I can tell you, it is true of the upper middle and low income economies. And as I say, in Jamaica, the Minister of Finance announced that as of October 8, the COVID-related non-debt expenditure stood at 36.8 billion Jamaican dollars. And when we added increase in interest costs to this figure, the total COVID-19 expenditure impact to date is 43.8 billion Jamaican dollars. That's some 303 million US dollars. And if we put it in perspective, what we have spent in less than a year to address the pandemic amounts to the planned recurrent and capital expenditure for the entire 2021 financial year for 5 of our government ministries, critical ones: justice, tourism, foreign affairs, labor and social security, culture, gender, entertainment. So the pandemic has drastically increased expenditure while at the same time reducing revenues available to government. And in the case of Jamaica, the impact on the revenue has been sudden and it has been severe. And I noted Carmen Gita speaking about the inevitable increase in debt stock that will arise. And you know, there is that troubling question for countries like Jamaica, is the response of the international financial community to highly indebted middle-income countries. I'd use the opportunity to say that even as we look at new policies in response, I believe this is an area that will have to be looked at again, because if your debt to GDP is so high, then the room that you have for expenditure on other matters become even lower. And I do believe that the time has come, if not past, for a new approach to be taken for the highly indebted middle-income countries. So we have also seen revenue from international trade taxes, the custom duties, the stamp duties, the GCT on imports, that's the general consumption tax, lower than what it has been before because of the closure in the airports and the seaports. For us, the second quarter GDP declined by 8.4% compared to year-on-year quarter. The impact has been felt across all sectors. Decline in service industries, 20%. Goods producing industries, 30%. Hotel and restaurant sector alone has recorded a decline of 86%, largely due to the closure of the ports. And then what we find is that a number of persons who are employed in these sectors, they are the ones who are severely impacted. They have to resort to their savings. And government has to respond in a way to ensure that the economic problem does not become a huger social problem, showing up in all kinds of other behaviors that countries like my own are challenged with. So just moving quickly to the social and economic consequences of the pandemic and the interconnectedness, which has already been mentioned. You know, I've always said that one's budget indicates the priority through your spending. If you want to look at what any government, regardless of rhetorics, prioritize, look on what it is prepared to expend on. And to a large extent, current and capital expenditure will reflect what the government considers to be most urgent. So here in Jamaica, we have had to do a number of supplementary budget. In fact, only yesterday, we went through that exercise in the Parliament. And the priority, taking into account the reality in Jamaica, began with back to school grants for as inclusive a response as possible. And then when we calculated the space, having regard to what we're legally obligated to do, the COVID response we did in a multi-sectoral way. So we have students that are on special social security, what we call a PATH program. They were given priority. The government went into new expenditure to the extent of unemployment and employment support to benefit over 50,000 Jamaicans. Not at all enough, but it focused primarily on a lot who are vulnerably employed, persons who are out of work, and those who have had to resort to their savings and the drying up of those savings. We have the tourism workers, the entertainment workers, the restaurant workers, people in transportation, suddenly out of work, no fault of their own. So stipend provided to them. And then we looked at another area that we consider critical, and that was expenditure that would keep economic activity going and send a signal of confidence to the private sector that life has to go on in COVID. And so we've looked at road construction project that would bring employment to a number of persons. And this is where we're going, making it as inclusive as possible. Am I out of time?
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'm sure you'll have additional opportunity to give some more examples of the interventions you've done during the Q&A. but I really thank you for putting in clear terms this. You talked a lot about rebalancing, but let me call it the balancing act you have to do when in fact COVID response had consumed so much, 303 million of your budget, which was equivalent to what 5 ministries needed for their recurrent expenditure. I think you put the reality for a number of us developing countries in clear terms for everybody. Thank you so much, Honorable Marlene Forte. We now want to invite Martin Chogong, Secretary General of the IPU, to take the floor, our spokesperson, I suppose, for all parliamentarians as well. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. Thank you for giving me the floor, and I would like to say how pleased I am and honored I am to be able to address this session of the Parliamentary Forum. I really commend the Parliamentary Network, the World Bank, and the IMF for this initiative that brings together parliamentarians to reflect together and identify ways in which to help the global community respond effectively to the current pandemic crisis. And I have in the background been listening to Carmen Whitehead and Jita Gopinath addressing very important issues in their presentations. And those issues for me are very critical when it comes to the current and expected future financial challenges caused by the pandemic, especially for emerging markets and developing countries. And I have heard from Ms. Gopinath how economic policy tools can greatly reduce emissions while also bolstering economic growth, employment opportunities, and income inequality. I am sure we are all agreed. I'm sure there has been ample discussion of the impact that the COVID crisis has had on our societies. And we are all agreed, I believe, that it is a wake-up call for countries around the globe. It is not only a health crisis. People often think that it is limited to the health sector, but a crisis with far-reaching social and economic impacts. And it has highlighted, as has been mentioned by many people, it has highlighted the fragilities that exist in our societies and within our economic structures. And I would say it has also deepened inequalities in our countries. So it is clear that the pandemic has not affected everyone equally. It exacerbated inequality, but also it has affected people unevenly. And those people in a society that are most vulnerable and are most affected by the crisis. I deduce from the presentations and other assessments that the pandemic is likely, I'm sure, is going to delay progress in achieving the SDGs, pushing critical development targets beyond reach. This again will hit the most vulnerable and marginalized people in society the hardest. So I want also to make the point that we are experiencing this pandemic amid an era of catastrophic environmental change, and the world is experiencing unprecedented impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and increasing habitat and biodiversity loss. Many people who have been hit the hardest by the COVID pandemic are also likely to be dealing with severe challenges created by climate change. I would therefore make the point that there is an urgent need for COVID-19 recovery strategies that are both inclusive and in line with climate action and environmental protection. The recovery provides an opportunity to follow more sustainable development pathways that give priority to both human and environmental well-being. It is important that countries implement forward-looking, well-resourced, and inclusive responses that are aligned with international agreements on development and climate change. Through their legislative, budgetary, oversight, and representation functions, parliaments have a key role to play in shaping both immediate and long-term recovery efforts. As countries are now resetting their priorities and reallocating resources to deal with the pandemic, parliaments are in a position to influence policies and budgets to ensure they build back better from COVID-19. The legislative measures taken today will have a long-term effect on the planet's future. And as many people are saying, going back to business as usual cannot be an option. The IPU has made supporting parliaments and parliamentarians in their efforts to tackle climate change in an inclusive way a priority. The IPU's bilateral, regional, and international parliament engagement to facilitate the sharing of good practices and lessons learned in addressing the climate emergency and in achieving sustainable development. It is in this context that we have been working with the United Nations Environment Programme to identify key approaches that parliamentarians may wish to consider in promoting a sustainable and green recovery that will not only build or help build more resilient economies, but will also contribute to meeting countries' international commitments under the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The approaches are now outlined in a forthcoming joint policy note that we will be issuing with UNEP, which parliamentarians will use for their efforts to contribute to efforts to mitigate climate change. This note outlines a number of green economy approaches, including in relation to clean energy, green jobs, and biodiversity, and proposes parliamentary actions within each of these areas. For example, clean and renewable energy reduces greenhouse gas emissions and can accelerate energy access in developing countries. Clean energy can be prioritized in COVID-19 recovery packages. Parliaments and parliamentarians have the unique opportunity to advance laws that contribute to both short and long-term energy policies that promote the shift to renewable energy. I also want to point out that this note highlights how a shift to a greener economy could create millions of jobs. Parliaments can introduce recovery laws that incentivize green investment and create employment in sustainable transport and energy efficiency sectors. At the same time, the note illustrates how parliaments can adopt legislation to ensure that COVID-19 recovery packages do not have any negative impacts on ecosystems and that they actively work to prevent or to preserve biodiversity, including through appropriate budgetary allocations. The policy note also recognizes the challenges faced by poor people, women, people with disabilities, indigenous people, and other marginalized groups, in illustrating the need for recovery legislation that is both gender responsive and socially inclusive. Let me now conclude by saying that the recovery process from this pandemic is a great challenge, but it's also, as is the case with all challenges, a unique opportunity to follow a more just and sustainable pathway. The IPU is fully committed to supporting parliaments around the globe in implementing COVID-19 recovery activities that jointly contribute to environmental and development objectives. In doing so, we can ensure that the most vulnerable groups of the population are not left behind and that we protect the environment as we recover. Now, thank you so much for Parliament and all stakeholders to seize the opportunity to drive transformational change for a more green, inclusive, and sustainable society that benefits both people and the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I'm sure all colleagues on this forum look forward to the note that you have. It will give us a good blueprint as to what we can do as parliamentarians to support some of the policies that the governments will be bringing to us for discussion. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. For Carmen and Jita, we have a lot of MPs who have questions, so I'll try to take them in batches of 3s. And I start with the first batch. Anatoly Akasakov, Member of Parliament from Russia. I want to plead with colleagues to make it short so that we can bring in as many colleagues as possible. So 3 at a time. So the first one, Anatoly from Honorable Member of Parliament from Russia. Over to you, sir.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Because I couldn't. Okay. One moment.
We can see you as well.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm from Russia. You know that we met COVID during the sanction because some West countries use these, I think, not law measures against our country, but our government during the pandemic has taken extraordinary measures to make sure that the economy and especially small and medium businesses do not shut down and unemployment does not significantly increase. The government has provided special subsidized loans for the businesses to stay afloat and retain their employees. Families with young children have received special lump sum payments while fighting the pandemic, keeping the economy going and keeping the employment law is at the center of the government policy. You know that we produce vaccine against coronavirus, and some my colleagues and members of government now got vaccinated, and I advise you to use it, do it. You know that Mr. Putin decided to send vaccine to United Nations, and I think IMF and World Bank can use it too. Second, what I would like to say about green economy. You know that our government, maybe you know that our government focus for this problem, but however, recent spillage of toxins in the Arctic region underscored the importance of the problem. We have a task force which consists of the State Duma, Ministry of Economy, VEB, Russia's Development Bank, and the Russian Central Bank, which work on defining what green projects are and determining stimulus measures such as subsidized and preferential central bank regulation to make these projects more economically attractive for project sponsors and investors. And my question for the
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
the World Bank and IMF, we would like to draw more on your experience for stimulating green and socially responsible projects in different regions of the world. I'm sure that there are mechanisms which have proven to yield largest result for small cost. And I would like to ask what World Bank can do for this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The second question is from Alphonse Nombre, Honorable Member of Parliament of Burkina Faso. Alphonse, Honorable Alphonse. Burkina Faso.
Oui, oui,
Can
bonjour.
you switch your mic
Good
on?
morning.
Please go ahead. Bonjour, monsieur.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. And thank you for giving me the floor and the opportunity to participate in this important forum. I have a question.
Les objectifs de développement durable.
The SDGs
La voie pour l'exploitation durable
tell us
des ressources et la réduction des inégalités sociales.
that in order to reduce social inequalities and
À cause
use resources
de
sustainably
volonté politique,
are our goals, but we see that there is a lack of political will
en quoi
in some countries and some important countries. So I'd like to know
post-Covid est-elle possible
how a green
cette volonté politique?
and inclusive rebound and recovery is possible in view of the lack of political will.
Volker Klein, Honorable Member of Parliament from Germany. Thank you very much, Alphonse. Volkmar?
Thank you very much. I would like to know about your insight and assessment of the danger of de-investment in emerging markets and developing countries because of a potential shortage of equity. So Basel requirements for equity probably can mean that a lot of companies and financial institutions could focus on their home markets and less risk markets. And that, I think, can be easily a problem for emerging markets and developing countries. What can we do to fight it?
Thank you very much. Carmen and Gita, I can start first with Gita probably and then go to Carmen.
Yes, thank you again. Very happy to listen to all the comments from the parliamentarians. Quick responses to the questions, and I can work backwards on financing for emerging markets. I assume the question is broadly about financing, not just about green or anything specific, but more generally about funding. What we are seeing right now is, because of the very large policy support that's provided by central banks around the world in terms of, cutting interest rates, liquidity measures, asset purchases, swap lines. We are in an environment where many emerging markets are actually borrowing now at lower rates than they did pre-pandemic. Now, especially this is true for high investment grade emerging markets. And since we expect that interest rates will stay low for long in advanced economies, I expect that there will be a search for yield that will look outside of advanced economies, and emerging markets will be a destination for these flows. But at the same time, there are, frontier economies that are having a much harder time in raising capital. You can see, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, you haven't seen any new debt issued since the start of this pandemic externally. So there is differentiation that you see there. And as long as this crisis is around, that will be an issue. But I think the solution has to be that over time, there some countries will need just debt relief, and sometimes just outright debt restructuring to put themselves on a more sustainable path in terms of their finances. And international financing will be concessional aid, grants will also be needed. On the question of green and how to have a green and inclusive agenda when there's a lack of political will, I would make a couple of points. I would say increasingly the will of people is changing towards wanting to live in an environment which has lower levels of pollution. They realize their health benefits, and they realize, the value of having cleaner air. Secondly, and this is something we emphasize a lot, is that when to do this, the package that we are talking about, which is to bring net emissions down to zero by 2050, it's not enough just to have big green infrastructure push or an increase in carbon prices, but you do want to use the carbon revenues, a portion of it, to compensate lower income households for increasing costs of energy in the transition period. And this is very important to also get political will to make this politically feasible. And on the question of green and socially responsible projects and how to do that at the least cost, the way to do that, of course, is to incentivize private sector investment. And that is possible if you do two things. One is pre-announced gradually increasing path of carbon pricing. That gives private sector the incentive to do the required investment, which means that it's not a fiscal cost. And the second piece is, of course, there is a fiscal piece that will have to be incurred to provide the green infrastructure of which the private sector can leverage off and come up with new kinds of innovations. But as I told you, those costs are not that large, and some of the carbon revenues, the carbon pricing revenues, can be used towards that. Anyway, I can't go into all the details, but Chapter 3 of the World Economic Outlook is kind of exactly answers the question that you laid out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Carmen, would you like to add anything? I'll move on then to the second set.
I would like.
Please go ahead.
Unfortunately, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Unfortunately, I didn't have my translation when Alphonse was speaking, so I would love to have his question. On Volkmar's question, that is a concern, right? That is a concern. When I said there's a lot of headwinds to, the goals are clear that green investment, building back better, is what the collective, this is the collective goal, but among the hurdles is generating also private capital flows to developing and emerging markets in an environment in which uncertainty has remained very high since the beginning of the year. And that uncertainty translates to risk premia. And it means that, which is why I left with a message that the global community needs to work hard in all these dimensions. The International Finance Corporation, for example, is working very hard on private partnerships to bring in private capital flows because the risks that at a time in which there are concerns about recovery, concerns about debt, general global uncertainty, that the private capital flows will become increasingly skittish, and the much needed long-term financing has a lot of risks. I do think there is a lot of scope from from NGOs. Certainly, as I said, the IFC is very active on this, on trying to crowd in the private sector.
Carmen, if I could paraphrase what Alphonse was driving at, he was talking about political will. As you look at the recovery programs that you are helping countries develop now, to what extent do you see the political will to choose, for example, greener investments, the greener stimulus Gita was referring to, as opposed to business as usual? Do you see the presidents, the finance ministers in developing countries making those choices? I think that's where he's headed, that political will to make
And
those choices.
it's an excellent point. And you know, we're at a moment in which there's a lot of and Marlene made the point brilliantly. You know, the demands are enormous, the resources are limited. It's very importantly also about allocation and making choices. And I think, you know, among the long list of concerns, I've talked about some of the economic ones, but on the political dimension, I would flag two, and they're interrelated. They're related to Alphonse's question. One is, what are the risks of reversals, policy reversals? So it's not just moving forward on green and moving forward on reforms. It's bad times in which difficult choices have to be made, often are also very high risk periods politically for reversals. And you know, things like dollar shortages, you know, as commodity prices are low, as there are reserve scarcities, you know, capital controls, restrictions, all kinds of policies that there had been a move away from may return. And that is damaging. And this goes to the question of what can be done to attract foreign green capital. And so there's this clash. But I want, you know, I think, you know, the international role from both bilateral official, from multilaterals, and from NGOs could be a catalyst to, you know, to channel into green investment and to avoid what is, I think, an extremely risky period as our deep economic downturns, to avoid policy reversals and move forward.
Martin, I know you want to jump in, but as you give your own quick answer, if governments do not have that political will to drive that green aspect of the transition, do you see parliaments having that will? Do you sense that speakers and parliamentarians have that interest now to nudge governments in the direction that Gita and to capitalize on the opportunities that Gita mentioned? Martin, do you want to weigh in on this political will question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Yukena. I think that there is no institution that is more political than parliaments. And I think that much of what is going to happen will happen because parliaments want it to happen. So I take a point that parliaments push their governments towards greener recovery packages. And they have the powers to do that. You know, their constitutions allow them to hold government to account, to legislate and prioritize certain areas. What is important, there is a precondition, and that precondition is that there should be a conversation between those people who are driving these international agreements with parliaments at the country level. Too often, we have agreements that land on the table of parliament without parliament having been properly briefed on the advantages and disadvantages of the measures that are contained in the agreement. And so it is important that that conversation take place in parliament between the international community, between the government and parliament. That is the point I want to make. Otherwise, you will not have that ownership and you will not have the political will and commitment.
Yeah, usually the finance minister comes back from Washington and then we see the agreement, right? After the
That's
fact.
right. That's
right. We take another set of questions. Yabisi Kagbara, MP of Togo. Please, 1 minute. Go ahead, sir. Yabis, Honorable Yabisi Kagbara.
Yabis, Kambara, Togo.
Please put your mic on. We can't hear you. Honorable Yabisi. Well, we can then go to Honorable Kasum Yakuba Maiga, Member of Parliament of Niger. Honorable Kasum. Okay, not on yet. We'll move on. Honorable Redha Faraj, Member of Parliament, Bahrain. Honorable Redha.
Yes.
Please
Good
go ahead.
afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you very much
yes.
also for allowing me to ask the question. My question
Yes,
is due to the quantum of resources needed to achieve a green economic and social recovery. The developing world, or countries as a whole, will struggle to achieve these objectives. Where do you see the world assisting the developing countries given lack of funds, perceived ecological and obligations, and policy needed? Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll take from Honorable Aissa Mado, Member of Parliament, Chad.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais
Thank you very much. I would like to sincerely congratulate all of you for your brilliant interventions. This is my question. Can institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, have they been able to assess and quantify the social and economic impact of COVID-19 on our countries, especially Sahel and Lake Chad Basin countries? Chad is located in that region. If they have, I would like to know what strategy would be put in place or is being put in place to increase the resilience of the countries and people to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, this pandemic is taking a heavy toll in spite of our country's efforts. So I would like to know how the countries can be supported in promoting green and inclusive and circular economy. Thank you.
ST Putri, Honorable Member of Parliament of Indonesia. Are you on? Honorable Putri from Indonesia. All right. Honorable Fatih Bakali, Member of Parliament, Morocco. Are you able to come on?
Hi there. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Fatih, and I'll, go ahead. I'll go back to you. Let me get Fatih on. Fatih, go ahead. Honorable Fatih. Fatiha.
Fatiha Bakali from Morocco.
Yes, please, yes.
Yes. Good morning, leaders and gentlemen. Je suis parlementaire.
I am a Moroccan member of parliament. My question goes to the IMF and World Bank representatives. Can we foresee a cancellation of the debt of developing countries to help them exit the social and economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic? Secondly, what are the measures that are being taken to ensure food security around the world? Thank you.
First to you, I know you have to leave us in a few minutes. Why don't you take a crack at these, and then I'll go over to Carmen, and then I'll bring our colleague in Jamaica in to also assist.
Okay, yes, thank you. I'm sorry I have a hard stop at 10:30. On the question on fiscal resources for the green transition, one of the points we make is, so yes, it's not going to be costless. The fiscal deficit will go up between 5 to 6%, but that's over a decade. So it's a long period. And governments will also benefit from the higher carbon tax, which will bring carbon revenues. And because you've mitigated catastrophic risks to the economy, you end up with higher levels of income, and that helps you. So in some sense, it's actually not costly. Secondly, you want to put the incentives in place to get private sector investment to happen, which is why carbon pricing, R&D subsidies, for instance, would help. And that's where most of the investment would come about. But again, there will be some countries that will need in the transition some international support. I'll leave the question on social and economic impact of COVID-19 and what's being proposed to deal with it to Carmen. I mean, just very quickly, this is a crisis like no other. We have seen collapses in economic activity of magnitudes we haven't seen before. And if you're a country that relies heavily on tourism, on the hospitality sector, that relies on oil exports, the hit is being really high. And then and the path going forward, the recovery is incredibly weak. So there are many challenges. I will just flag that at the IMF, we have provided financing to 81 countries at a record speed, and 76 of that financing was basically emergency financing, very quickly, without conditions, but to just ensure that countries are able to deal with this current crisis. We've also provided debt service relief to our poorer members who owes debt to the IMF, and we've extended that by another 6 months. We've also called for debt service relief from the G20, which is how this GSS, along with the World Bank and the DSSI incentive initiative, came out of that. And we've been very clear that the countries that have high unsustainable debt levels, you can't kick the can down the road. You really need to deal with the restructuring now. And this comes to the last question about cancellation of debt for developing countries. So for countries where the debt is unsustainable, you need to have restructuring and reprofiling. So this has to be done on a case-by-case basis, but it's important to have a common framework. So it's not just about your debt to official creditors, but it includes everybody, your debt to official creditors, to private creditors. And so there is true a debt reduction that happens for countries that are in debt to stress and have a future that is highly challenged and quite difficult. And so with that, I will stop.
Jita, can I squeeze in one last question for you? Do you see appetite for carbon pricing? A lot of what you've said depends on that revenue flow from potential carbon pricing. Apart from China's announcement now in the European Union, do you see appetite anywhere else for carbon pricing?
So in terms of the proposal that we are putting in, we are asking for a gradual increase in carbon prices, precisely for the reason that I don't think there is the ability to put in a very large carbon price at this point. But we're seeing, so for instance, in the US, there are 11 states where you're seeing carbon pricing happening. And the world actually recognizes increasingly that you cannot deal with catastrophes of this kind, with overheating planet. And so I believe it exists, but it will have to be gradual.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. And have a good meeting in the next call.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carmen, over to you.
I will have to be very brief, as I also have to literally run to another meeting. Let me try to address both, Isa's and Fatha's questions on what is being done and what the next steps may look like. In terms of what is being done, as Geeta mentioned, and I will try to go through it quickly, there's been different kinds of lending. The World Bank has lent to 111 countries this year. The amounts are record. And the lending can be for general budgetary support for whatever the needs that arise. It can be more targeted in medical. And also the World Bank has engaged in a lot of programs on cash transfers. And the cash transfers programs are basically also trying to reach out to segments of the population that are in the informal sector that, you know, where safety nets do not currently exist. So the World Bank has supported, this year, various activities in the health, the general budgetary support, cash transfers, and of course, the more quote unquote standard products in terms of infrastructure and the like. The board, the World Bank board just also approved a 12 billion COVID facility to help emerging markets acquire vaccines. Obviously, there is the concern that there is great pent-up demand by the advanced economies for the vaccines. So this is a program that, with partners, we are trying to make sure that the vaccine, that developing countries have access. And the program, I don't have real time to go into the details, but it's importantly also targeted to first having those vaccines accessible for healthcare providers. So the range of what is being done is quite broad. I mentioned earlier also in the International Finance Corporation, the issue of concerns about capital flows, the drying up of capital flows. So there, there's the initiative to try to bring in the private sector. There's also initiatives. This is important. It gets to Fatia's question on debt. The IFC also has programs to help restructure private sector debt, businesses that have been hit hard and need to be restructured as a consequence of the shutdowns and the collapses in economic activity. On the debt front, beyond the DSSI, to recap, the debt suspension initiative introduced in May was allowing low-income countries under IDA countries to apply for a temporary debt moratorium of 6 months. The idea being that funds that are not used to service debt can be rechanneled to other better uses during the emergency. That initiative is being extended for another 6 months with the idea that in the April meetings, there will be stock taking and review to see if it needs to be extended another 6 months beyond that. But that is on the temporary side, which is different from the issue that Fatia has raised on debt cancellation. To be realistic, let me just finish. To be realistic, yes. I think that the key word there is going to be done case by case. And so let me conclude and thank you all. I have to run also to another meeting. I am sure your schedules are also equally full. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you, Gita, for joining us, and honorable members of parliament for joining this forum. I know we don't have enough time, but we want to thank everybody for joining. I think the messages are clear. To deal with the crisis we have, the adjustments will take time, at least 5 to 6 years, if we want to see a real recovery, not just a rebound, as Carmen said. But we also have heard of the opportunities for greener growth, the huge job opportunities that come with that possibility for a green growth strategy. but also the resilience that we're building for a better future. I want to thank all the participants. We hope that this dialogue will continue with Brian in future forums. We can take some of these ideas also home to our parliaments and help build that political will that we're going to need to make the hard choices. To get a better future, we'll have to make hard choices now. This is the critical decade to 2030 to keep emissions down, but also have to have inclusive growth for all. Thank you very much, and we look forward to another opportunity.